You weren't unpredictable. You were unreadable because you never played a game you didn't design yourself. Now imagine this for a moment. Chosen one. A skilled player walks into a room, confident, cunning, ready to control the board. But the moment they sit across from you, they freeze. Why? Because for the first time, they're not in charge. The rules don't apply. The moves don't work. Their tricks fall flat. That's what you did to them. You weren't the opponent they prepared for. You were the test they failed before it even began. And here's a fact most don't talk about. In psychological studies, manipulators thrive on repetition. They depend on loops, emotional reactions, predictable habits, weaknesses they can pull like strings. But when someone breaks that loop, it creates something they hate, uncertainty. And you, chosen one, didn't just break the loop, you shattered the entire pattern. You handled them like no one ever could, and now they can't stop thinking about it. And hey, chosen one, listen. Don't forget to pay this message back by simply pressing the like and subscribe buttons to help spread this message to more souls. It's the responsibility of all of us to spread the light. And thank you, chosen one, for being part of this mission. You're not just watching, you are part of a force. Let's get back to it. The universe doesn't randomly pick people. It selects those who move different, those who feel too much, see too deep, and act without needing applause. That's you, the chosen one. You weren't just another chapter in their life. You were the part of the story that didn't follow the script, and that shook them. See, when you walked in, they thought you were like everyone else. Easy to read, easy to use. They smiled, tested you, tried their little tactics. But what they didn't realize was, while they were busy trying to figure you out, you were already 3 steps ahead. Calm on the surface, calculating in silence, fully aware of the energy they carried. And you didn't react, you observed. They tried to bait you into arguments. You stayed quiet. They tried to make you feel small. You stood firm. They wanted you to explain yourself, but you gave them silence so loud it echoed. You didn't play defense. You mastered strategy. You didn't fold. You flowed. You didn't chase closure. You became the closure. Now they're spiraling, not because you hurt them, but because they couldn't touch you. You became the one that got away, not because you disappeared, but because you were never theirs to begin with. They study your moves like it's a puzzle they should have solved, but the pieces don't fit. Why? Because you never fit inside the box they built for you. They're obsessed now, haunted even, not because you did something cruel, but because you did something rare. You saw through them and didn't flinch. That's power most people never taste, and you held it without making a sound. You were their unsolvable equation, the storm that arrived with no warning, the light they couldn't dim. They tell themselves stories to feel in control, but deep down, they know you handled them like no one else ever could. And that's why they keep coming back in their mind, replaying conversations, rewriting memories, hoping they missed something, some clue, some angle that would have given them the upper hand. But there was nothing. Because while they were playing games, you were building walls they couldn't climb. The truth is, chosen one, you didn't just protect your peace, you became the storm that ended theirs. They can't figure out how you walked away so intact, how you dodged every trap without even blinking. But you know why. Because you were never playing defense. You were the one holding the blueprint the whole time. This isn't just about being smart. It's about being aligned with your intuition, your boundaries, your energy. The universe gave you sight that pierced through masks, and you saw them fully. That's what terrified them the most. So let them obsess, let them wonder. You owe no explanations. You are not a glitch in their system. You are the reason the system failed. And that, chosen one, is your power. So, are you really ready to break it down step by step? The why behind their obsession, the how behind your power, and the truth they still can't admit. Drop 777 in the comments if you've ever left someone spinning in confusion simply by being unshakably you. And if you feel this message hitting home, consider fueling the mission with a super thanks. Whether it's a cent or a blessing in words, every bit helps keep this light reaching more souls like you. We're not just talking, we're building something real here. A force, a movement, a mirror held up to those who thought they had you figured out. And now, let's break it all down, one layer at a time. If you truly are one of the chosen ones, you won't just hear this, you'll feel it. Let's get started. Number 1. They thought you were an open book. Turns out, you were a locked vault with no key made for them. They didn't lose you, they lost to you. And that stings far more than they'll ever admit. Let's not sugarcoat it. They thought they had you down to a science, that you were just another profile, another personality, another soul to toy with, mold, manipulate and leave behind like they've done so many times before. They thought your silence meant confusion, that your kindness was naivety, that your distance was weakness. But the joke's on them, because while they were busy building strategies to play you, they walked straight into a storm their ego couldn't survive. Now imagine this, a predator confident in its routine, circling what it assumes is prey. But this time, the prey doesn't run, it watches, quiet, still, unbothered. The predator lunges, but its claws hit air. Its tactics fail. It's thrown off, and for the first time, it realizes this wasn't prey at all. It was a mirror, and what it saw in that reflection, its own emptiness. That's exactly what happened when they met you, chosen one. They approached you like a riddle meant to be solved, but you weren't a riddle. You were a labyrinth, a shifting maze of insight, stillness, and intuition. They entered your world with arrogance, believing their usual tricks would work. But the moment they tried to apply their tired patterns to your unique energy, everything they thought they knew shattered. You didn't panic. You didn't explain. You didn't dance for their attention. That silence, it screamed louder than any confrontation ever could. See, when a manipulator loses control, they don't walk away. They spiral, because it's not just about power to them. It's about pride. It's about ego. And when their ego doesn't get fed the reaction it craves, it turns on itself. That's the obsession you're seeing now. They're not haunted by your love. They're haunted by your control. You were unshaken in storms they created to break you. You were composed in chaos they manufactured to make you crumble. You weren't supposed to stand tall. You weren't supposed to stay quiet. But you did, and that wrecked them. They played emotional chess. You played universal alignment. They ran patterns. You disrupted them with clarity. They expected you to be like the rest, but the rest was never you. You were the version they couldn't predict. The moment you refused to respond like their past victims, they lost their grip. They had questions, dozens of them, but you offered no answers. That's power. Let's answer the one they keep screaming inside. Why couldn't I figure them out? Because you weren't built to be figured out. You were built to be respected, studied maybe, but never solved. Your mind didn't follow their scripts. Your heart wasn't available for manipulation. You were too self-aware, too aligned, too protected by experience and internal clarity. You weren't guarded. You were grounded. You weren't defensive. You were divine strategy in motion. And now they sit with the ghost of what they couldn't conquer. They sit with the ache of not knowing, the endless rewind in their head. What were they thinking? How did they see through me? Why didn't they react? That's the part they'll never recover from. You saw them fully and didn't flinch. You didn't try to fix them. You didn't try to fight them. You didn't beg to be understood. You simply walked away with your energy intact. And to a manipulator, that's a brutal loss. Because you didn't lose. You left them feeling like the one who got played. The beauty of your silence, it exposed their entire playbook. They can't even use those tricks anymore, not without remembering how easily you dismantled every one of them with nothing but calm and presence. Now they're obsessed, not because they loved you, but because you broke the mirror they used to see themselves in. You didn't feed their ego, you starved it. You didn't react, you reflected, and you left quietly, which made the noise in their head even louder. They still check your name, still look for signs, still wonder if they were ever in control, and deep down, they know they never were. You weren't just a chapter they could turn the page on. You were the sentence they never got to finish, the story they keep trying to rewrite in their head, but it never ends the way they want, because you weren't a plot twist. You were the ending. So now they sit with that wound, a wound that doesn't bleed, but it burns. Because every time they remember you, they don't remember winning. They remember losing their grip, losing their pride, losing control, and worst of all, losing access. Let that motivate you, chosen one, not to be cold, but to be clearer than ever on your worth. Let their obsession remind you just how rare your energy is. Let their spiral remind you that peace isn't just protection, it's power. Because you didn't rise to their bait, you rose above their reach. And that's what truly hurt them. You weren't just out of their league, you were out of their comprehension. They tried to figure you out like a math problem, but you were a language they never learned. And now, you're gone. Not lost, gone, intentionally, unreachable, and nothing drives them crazier than a mystery that never gives up its answers. That's your legacy. That's your echo in their mind. And no matter how many people they try to replace you with, they'll always come up short. Because what they really miss is never having had you at all. Number 2. They wanted you triggered, but you showed up trained, calculated, and completely out of reach. You didn't lose your temper, and that's when they knew. They lost their grip. You weren't emotional, you were surgical. Every move you made cut their ego deeper. While they were playing tug-of-war with your feelings, you dropped the rope and walked away with your peace. They set emotional traps, but you brought a blueprint and never stepped on a single one. Imagine this: a storm is brewing, wild and chaotic, lightning cracking, wind howling. They thought you'd be the tree that snaps under pressure, but instead you were the mountain, unmoved, unshaken. They screamed into the wind, and you simply listened, calm like the sky before sunrise. That's what destroyed them. They were prepared for a battlefield. You gave them silence. They were hoping for a war. You gave them strategy. They came to break you down, chosen one. That was the plan. Rile you up, trigger you, get you emotional enough to say something they could twist, do something they could blame, act in a way they could call unstable. But instead of reacting, you responded with restraint, with timing, with poise. You moved like a chess master, not a victim. You made your moves with precision, not panic, and they never saw it coming. They were used to people folding, used to emotional outbursts and dramatic confrontations. That's how they stay in control, create chaos, then sit back and pretend to be the calm, logical one. Stir the pot, then act like they're just reacting to the mess you made. It's their oldest play in the book. But this time, the pot didn't boil. The room stayed calm. You didn't scream, didn't beg, didn't fall for the setup. You watched, you measured, you chose your response, and that scared them more than anything you could have said. They tried to set fires in your spirit, but you didn't burn. You simply turned off the gas and let them sit in their own smoke. That's why they're still obsessed. That's why they can't let it go. Because they didn't just lose control, they lost credibility, power, and pride, all in one silent blow. You didn't defend yourself because you didn't need to. You didn't explain yourself because you knew the truth didn't require validation. You didn't prove your worth. You embodied it. And that kind of self-possession, it's foreign to people who rely on drama to feel important. Now they're left with questions they can't answer. Why didn't they react? Why didn't they fight back? Why didn't it work? The answer, because you weren't playing to win their approval. You were playing to protect your peace. You were never in survival mode. You were in strategy mode. And your strategy was simple. Don't feed what's trying to consume you. They were hoping to provoke. You brought poise. They needed you to explode. You chose elevation. And that right there, that's what turned their game into a failure. Think of a boxer, wild in the ring, throwing punches without rhythm, without thought, trying to knock out their opponent with raw force. But across from them is someone still, steady, calculating every angle, not wasting a move, not flinching, just watching, waiting. That's how you showed up. They wore themselves out trying to hit targets you'd already outgrown, and now they're standing alone in the ring, exhausted, while you've already moved on. You didn't give them the reaction, they needed that to win. And since they didn't get it, they couldn't control the narrative. That narrative was their weapon, but you took that away. That's why it hurts. That's why they're pacing. That's why you haunt them. You flipped the entire dynamic. You weren't emotional, you were dangerous, because calm people scare chaotic people. Disciplined people expose the recklessness of manipulators. And when they realized they couldn't make you become who they wanted, they panicked, internally, quietly, because they had no plan for this version of you. Even now, they replay it in their heads. That moment you walked away without a meltdown. That time you replied with calm instead of cursing. The silence after their last disrespect that told them louder than words ever could. You are done. You became untouchable. Not because you disappeared, but because you refused to engage. You chose control over chaos, and that's a language they don't speak. They don't know what to do with someone who doesn't need the last word, who doesn't fight for closure, who doesn't show their hand. And here's what tears at them most. You saw every jab. You felt every slight. You weren't unaware. You just didn't flinch. You didn't let their tactics bend your truth. You understood the assignment. Protect your energy at all costs. You didn't break because you'd already built yourself in silence long before they tried to test your foundation. They thought they were getting a puppet. Instead, they met a mirror and saw all the brokenness they tried to hide reflected back at them. And now that you're gone, that mirror's gone too, and they can't stand it. Let them spiral. Let them question. Let them wonder how you stayed so steady while they lost control. That's your power. That's your legacy. Because your silence wasn't passive, it was surgical. Your distance wasn't weakness, it was a power move. Your calm wasn't compliance, it was command. And now you live rent-free in the one place they never wanted to see you. Their mind. You didn't lose them, you led them into losing themselves. And that, chosen one, is the kind of win they'll never recover from. Number 3, you walked in peacefully, but your energy exposed their entire masquerade. You didn't trigger them by doing anything wrong. You triggered them by being everything they pretend to be. You were a walking mirror, and what they saw in you was everything they were too afraid to become. You didn't show up to start a war, but your presence made their inner battles impossible to ignore. Truth doesn't have to shout to shake the room. It just has to walk in. Imagine this, a room full of cracked mirrors, taped together, polished on the surface, hiding years of damage underneath. Everyone walks by and sees only the reflection they want. But then you enter, and suddenly, without saying a word, those cracks become impossible to unsee. That's what your presence did. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't call anyone out. You were the call-out. Your peace, your honesty, your unapologetic realness. It hit harder than any insult ever could. They didn't hate you, chosen one. They hated what you exposed. You were calm, grounded, self-aware. That alone was a threat to people whose identities were stitched together with lies, performance, and pain avoidance. You didn't have to dig into their wounds. They bled the moment you walked in. And not because you caused the pain, but because your presence stripped away the distractions they used to avoid it. They've spent years perfecting the mask, pretending to be confident, faking empathy, acting secure. Then you showed up, actually confident, actually healed, actually content. And it wrecked them, because suddenly their entire identity felt hollow, standing next to yours. You weren't attacking them, but your wholeness felt like a personal insult to their brokenness. That's why they started shifting, throwing shade that didn't match the weather, competing in games you weren't even playing, smiling while secretly clenching their fists. Your energy didn't just trigger jealousy, it triggered identity collapse. You represented the version of themselves they buried deep under ego and excuses. And when you came around, that version started screaming to the surface. They didn't know whether to admire you or resent you, so they did both. And here's the truth, they were never uncomfortable because of something you said. It was because of what you represented. Proof that self-worth is earned, not bought. Proof that healing is possible without applause. Proof that peace can't be performed, it has to be lived. And they weren't ready for that. You weren't trying to change them, you were just being you. But when someone is committed to faking it, the presence of someone real is unbearable. That's why they stared so hard. That's why they copied, mocked, competed, and obsessed. Because deep down, your existence told them the truth their pride refused to accept. You could be free too, if you just let go of the lie. They weren't just triggered, they were unmasked, and now that you're gone, that silence is loud. The echo of what you made them feel still rings through their thoughts, not because you harmed them, but because you forced them to see how much harm they're doing to themselves. You didn't show up as a storm, you showed up as the sun, and the only thing sunlight ever does is reveal what's already there. Number 4. They thought they were playing you, but you were writing the rules the whole time. They didn't outsmart you, you outsilenced them. Your calm wasn't confusion, it was calculation. While they were playing chess, you were designing the board, the pieces, and the outcome. They thought you were a player, turns out you were the architect. Imagine a con artist walking into a room, smug, confident, thinking they've got their next mark in the bag. But what they don't know is the room was built by someone who's seen 1,000 cons before, and that someone was you. That's the energy you walked in with, chosen one. They thought they were playing you, but you weren't just playing the game. You were mapping it, building it, studying it with the patience of someone who doesn't just want to win, They want the truth. You didn't react because there was nothing new in their moves. You've seen that mask before, heard that tone, watched that same performance play out 100 times in different faces, so you stayed silent. Not because you were unsure, but because you knew exactly how far they'd go if you let them feel safe enough to perform. And that's what you did. You let them talk, you let them show, and they did. Oh, they did. They thought you were falling for it. That's the funniest part. They really believed they had the upper hand, that every fake compliment, guilt trip, emotional push and pull was pulling you in deeper. But the truth? You were letting the rope get longer because you already knew where it would lead. And when it tightened, it didn't trap you, it exposed them. You weren't confused, you were collecting data. Every inconsistency, every half-truth, every subtle manipulation. You didn't challenge it, not yet, because you understood the deepest truth about manipulators. Give them enough room, and they'll reveal everything. That's what terrifies them now. Not just that you saw through it, but that you saw it while it was happening and didn't even blink. They thought your silence meant they had control, but your silence was the most powerful move in the game. It meant you were documenting, not reacting, not defending, just waiting for the exact moment when all their illusions would collapse under their own weight. And that's why they're spiraling now, because they finally realized they were never in control. They weren't even the opponent. They were a case study, a pattern you already knew, a puzzle you let complete itself. You walked around their traps like you had the blueprint memorized, because you did. You didn't try to correct their lies, didn't try to match their energy, didn't fall into their drama. Why? Because your goal wasn't to win the argument. It was to win the war of awareness. And you won it the moment you refused to play by their emotional rules. Now they're replaying every moment in their head, every move they made, every fake smile they flashed, every manipulative twist they threw your way. And they're haunted. Not because you embarrassed them publicly, but because you saw them privately and said nothing. What do manipulators fear the most? Being seen. You saw everything and chose not to engage. You let them build their false sense of control, knowing all along that when the moment came, you would exit with everything they tried to take, your dignity, your peace, your power, intact. And that's what shattered them. They thought they were in charge, that they were puppeteering emotions, spinning webs. But when you didn't react, when you didn't give them the emotional explosion they were counting on, the web collapsed and the spider got stuck in its own creation. You were never confused. You were just careful. You didn't panic. You positioned. You didn't fight to be heard. You listened longer than they could fake it. Now you've walked away, and they're left pacing the ruins of a game they thought they won, looking for the moment it slipped through their fingers. But here's the twist. It never did, because they never had it. You were the storm behind the calm, the observer behind the smile, the strategist behind the silence. You weren't just playing the game. You were the game. Number 5. You didn't stay calm because you were weak. You stayed calm because you were already in control. They were yelling to feel powerful. You were quiet because you are powerful. They mistook your stillness for softness until they realized your silence was made of steel. You didn't need to raise your voice. You were the reason the room went quiet. They were swinging wildly in chaos while you stood so steady, it made their fury look foolish. Imagine this, a wildfire tearing through everything in its path, loud, dramatic, chaotic, and right in the middle of it, there you are, still, like an ancient tree with roots so deep, no flame can shake you. That was your energy, chosen one. They thought they were the storm, but you were the sky it burned out in. You didn't match their madness. You mastered the moment by refusing to give it your energy. They took one look at your calm and made the worst mistake manipulators always make. They thought it meant fear, that slow response. To them, it screamed hesitation, that silence. They thought it was retreat. But what they didn't see was the precision behind your pause. You weren't shutting down. You were tuning in. You weren't avoiding the fire. They were just too loud to notice you already had the extinguisher in your hand. You see, they came from a world where control means noise, where power looks like screaming, punishing, dominating. So when you stood there, grounded, composed, unbothered, they were thrown completely off balance because they were prepared for a battle of egos. You gave them something far more threatening, peace they couldn't manipulate. They couldn't compute how someone could be so clear without being confrontational, so strong without being aggressive. You didn't chase, you didn't beg, you didn't need to explain. And that absence of need, that's what broke them, because they thrive on emotional instability, on poking buttons until someone explodes. But you didn't just remove the buttons, you rewired the whole system. Your calm was sacred authority, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that commands respect. The kind that says, I'm not here to argue, I already know. You didn't dominate them by force. You dismantled them by not reacting. And that kind of self-control, that's rare, that's divine, that's unteachable. They kept throwing their best tactics, gaslighting, guilt-tripping, passive aggression, and every time you met it with stillness, not because you didn't feel it, but because you chose not to give it power. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy soaked in strength. Let's answer the question they keep asking themselves now. Why didn't it work? It didn't work because you're not built like the rest. You don't need to win arguments to win. You don't need to prove your point to make it clear. You don't need to respond to nonsense to show your value. You understood this one truth they've never grasped. True power is control over yourself, not others. And now that you're gone, they're shaken, because you never gave them the chaos they needed to stay relevant in your world. You walked through their storm like it was a light drizzle, and now the silence you left behind screams louder than any fight could have. They're still confused, still trying to find the switch they couldn't flip in you. But here's what they never understood. You are the switch. You decide what deserves your energy, what deserves your voice, what deserves your reaction. And they never qualified. That's why they keep coming back, mentally, emotionally, spiritually. You weren't just calm, you were untouchable. And that sacred authority, that unshakable peace, that's what they'll spend years trying to replicate, but never will. Because it wasn't an act, it was who you are. Number 6, you didn't give them closure. You gave them the mirror they've been avoiding their whole life. You didn't slam the door, you just disappeared and let the silence echo what words never could. You weren't cruel, you were final, and nothing stings a manipulator more than a goodbye they didn't get to control. Closure wasn't missing, it was replaced by consequence, and that was the real punishment. You didn't ghost them, you graduated from them. Imagine this, a performer standing on a stage, waiting for applause, waiting for the spotlight, waiting for their grand monologue to land. But the audience is gone, the seats are empty, the lights are out, the curtain has dropped. That's exactly how you left them, chosen one. They thought there'd be an ending on their terms. A final scene, a last performance, a well-timed conversation where they could spin the story, twist the truth, fake some guilt, pretend to understand. just long enough to wiggle their way back in. But you robbed them of that stage, and that's why they can't breathe. They didn't expect you to vanish. They expected fireworks, an emotional explosion, a meltdown they could point to and say, "See, that's the real problem." But what they got instead was the deadliest kind of goodbye: complete silence. No tears, no texts, no monologues, just a closed door and the cold realization that you didn't need a final word to make your point. That silence, that was your answer, and it's louder than anything you could have said. Because when someone loses the privilege of hearing from you, they start hearing themselves, and what they hear now is terrifying. They wanted closure, but they weren't seeking healing. They were seeking a reset, a rerun, another spin around the cycle. But you chose growth. You didn't give them a reason. They had plenty. You didn't list their wrongs. They lived them. You didn't give them the privilege of clarity because they never honored it when it was freely offered. So instead, you gave them what they actually earned: consequence. Now they sit in the quiet, haunted not by your voice, but by their own, asking themselves what you saw, wondering when you figured them out, regretting the moment they realized. You always knew. You didn't need to expose them. They're doing it to themselves every time they revisit a conversation that never came, every time they draft a message you'll never see, every time they scroll your page and wonder how you look so untouched while they fall apart. Let's answer the question burning in their mind. How can someone walk away like that without saying anything? Because you didn't leave to prove anything. You left to protect everything. Your peace, your growth, your identity. You realized you didn't need their understanding to validate your experience. You didn't need their apology to heal. You didn't need their confusion to guide your closure. So you gave yourself the most powerful ending of all. You ended it without their permission. And that chosen one is what keeps them up at night. Not the breakup, not the distance, but the lack of control. The fact that their usual tactics didn't work. The fact that they didn't get a final moment to plead, twist, fake remorse, or play the victim. You cut the cord, not with rage, but with restraint. And that's what broke them. Because they didn't just lose you, they lost access, they lost power. They lost the right to the version of you that saw them clearly and still chose to stay for a while. You were the mirror they weren't ready to face. And now, they're stuck staring at their own reflection, trying to piece together what happened without your help. That's not just absence, that's consequence. And it's the kind they'll never forget. Number 7. When they couldn't cage you with control, they tried to drown you in doubt, but you breathed truth the whole time. They couldn't overpower you, so they tried to overpower your reality. Gaslighting only works on those unsure of themselves. You were never unsure, you were just patient. They flipped the script. You read between the lines. They threw smoke bombs of confusion, forgetting you were the one holding the match. Imagine this: a magician on stage, spinning illusions, flashing lights, smoke everywhere. The crowd gasps, unsure of what's real and what's trickery. But one person in the audience doesn't flinch, doesn't clap, doesn't even blink. Why? Because they already know the sleight of hand. That one person, that was you. Chosen one when they couldn't control you, when their usual manipulation tactics failed, they panicked. Not outwardly, no. They're too calculated for that. Instead, they moved in silence, in shadows, twisting perception. They wanted you off balance, second-guessing everything. If they couldn't rule over your will, they'd try to colonize your mind. But here's what they didn't understand. You weren't searching for truth outside yourself. You were living it. They couldn't handle your resistance to their dominance. You didn't react when they raised their voice, didn't beg when they went cold, didn't break when they withheld love. So when control didn't work, they upgraded the manipulation. It became psychological warfare, gaslighting, rewriting history, calling you too emotional, too sensitive, or overthinking. It wasn't clumsiness. It was strategic distortion. But here's where their plan failed. You were built on solid ground. Yes, there were moments where their confusion tactics rattled you. You questioned your memory, replayed arguments, tried to make sense of the disconnect between their words and energy. You thought maybe it was you. Maybe you were overreacting. Maybe you were too hard to love. But then came that whisper. That still voice, that internal compass that refused to shut off. It didn't scream, but it never stopped pointing toward truth. You didn't confront their games right away. You studied them. You noticed when their timelines didn't add up. You tracked the patterns, the convenient forgetfulness, the blame shifting, the subtle digs they wrapped in smiles. You remembered how you felt in those moments. That's what saved you. The receipts weren't always screenshots. They were sensations, gut reactions, shifts in their tone, words that said one thing but energy that screamed another. You let it all build, quietly, patiently. Not because you were weak, but because you were calculating the exact weight of their lies. They expected confusion to weaken you, but confusion sharpened you. Their mind games became your training ground. Every manipulation sharpened your intuition. Every moment they tried to flip the blame made your clarity stronger. You weren't unraveling, you were evolving. And when the truth finally clicked into place, it was surgical. You didn't blow up. You didn't beg for an apology or try to correct their twisted version. You didn't need their admission to validate your knowing. You simply walked. Not because you were unsure, but because you finally saw everything. Let's answer what they're asking themselves now. How did I lose control so quickly? Because the control was never real. It was borrowed. From your kindness, from your grace, from your trust. And the moment you reclaimed that, the illusion collapsed. They're shocked, not because you left, but because you left clear-headed. You didn't stumble, you didn't crumble. You left with the very thing they tried to steal from you, your sanity, your truth, your self-trust. Now they sit with all their manipulative blueprints, and none of them work. Not anymore. Not on you. They couldn't break you. They couldn't shake you. And no matter how hard they tried to bend your reality, they failed to realize you were never looking through their lens. You had your own, and it saw everything. Number 8. They had a masterpiece in their hands, but they handled you like a scribble in the margin. You weren't unfinished, they just lacked the vision to recognize what was complete. They thought they were critiquing flaws. Turns out they were chiseling at marble already carved by fire and time. You didn't need fixing, they needed maturity to see you. You weren't too much, they were too small for the weight of your presence. Imagine an art collector standing in front of a one-of-a-kind painting, one that took years of storms, scars, healing, and rising to complete. But instead of honoring the beauty, they smudge it, critique it, suggest changes to something they couldn't even begin to understand. That's how they treated you, chosen one. Not like someone rare, not like someone sacred, but like a draft they had permission to edit. You gave them access to something real, something layered. You didn't show up needing approval, needing polish, or asking to be completed. You came with history, healing, humility, and power. And instead of standing in awe, they stood with a red pen, making notes, pointing fingers, dismissing your grace as softness, your patience as weakness, your depth as too complicated. They saw your evolution and assumed it needed direction, but the only thing lacking direction was them. You were already whole. But they treated you like a work in progress simply because they were uncomfortable with how finished you felt. And that's what they couldn't process. You weren't trying to impress. You weren't desperate to be chosen. You were the choice. You carried refinement born from fire, not from flattery. You had wisdom sharpened through trials. But they didn't know how to hold what doesn't need saving. They didn't know how to handle what stands tall without their validation. So they picked. They pushed. They tried to downplay your presence because it made their own shallowness harder to ignore. Instead of rising up to meet your level, they tried to drag you down to theirs, where love is about control, not connection, where power is taken, not earned. But you didn't shrink. You didn't conform. You didn't make yourself small just to keep their comfort intact. And that's what triggered them most. You refused to be made better by someone who didn't even know how to handle brilliance. They thought they had time. They thought they could leave and return at will, keep you on the shelf while they explored lesser things, then come back and expect the masterpiece to still be hanging there, untouched. But masterpieces aren't kept in rotation. They're placed in museums, protected, preserved, and out of reach once lost. Now that you're gone, they're not just mourning your presence, they're haunted by their ignorance. They're realizing they didn't just fumble someone good. They dismissed someone great. They ignored sacred in pursuit of superficial. And now, they stand outside the gallery, looking through the glass, wondering how they could have ever looked at you and not seen it. Let's answer what keeps echoing in their head. How did I miss it? Because they were never looking at you. They were looking for flaws to fix, not beauty to honor. They were projecting their unfinished story onto someone who already knew the ending. They saw your transparency as vulnerability, not realizing it was strength. They mistook your stillness for uncertainty, not realizing it was discipline. They thought you needed shaping, when in truth, you were the shape they couldn't hold. Now, the silence is unbearable, because it screams what you never had to say out loud. I wasn't a draft. I was the final edition, and you had the chance to read it, but you skimmed. They didn't just lose you. They lost the opportunity to become someone worthy of you. And that's a regret they'll carry long after the memory of you stops answering when they call. They had a masterpiece, and they treated it like scrap. Number 9. You didn't walk in to be their favorite. You walked in to be their wake-up call. You weren't sent to play along. You were sent to shake the room. You didn't fit their script because you weren't written by their pen. They wanted entertainment. What they got was revelation. You weren't loud, but your presence caused a silence they still can't explain. Imagine this: a room built on shadows, filled with smoke and mirrors, everyone playing a part, everyone clapping at the right lines. Then you walk in, still, quiet, eyes that see everything. You don't announce your presence. You don't compete for applause. But suddenly, the actors forget their lines. The script doesn't feel so solid. The masks start slipping. That's what you did. You weren't another character in their show. You were the end of the performance. They had a plan for people like you. Charm them, test them, tame them. But that plan depended on you wanting to belong, needing to be chosen, craving approval. And that's where they got it all wrong. Because you didn't come to play the role. They mistook your grace for gullibility, your patience for passivity, and you're quiet for compliance. But all of those were strength in disguise. You weren't a threat because you were loud. You were a threat because you were real. You didn't chase drama, but you disrupted their comfort. You didn't argue with their lies. You stood firmly in your truth. That alone was rebellion. Your presence was an interruption to the illusions they had spent years perfecting. You didn't call them out, your energy did. You didn't name their games, your discernment dismantled them silently. And now they're left wrecked, not by confrontation, but by revelation. You didn't show up with fireworks, you showed up with frequency, and that frequency exposed everything false in them. Their performance couldn't hold up under the pressure of your presence. The room got quiet when you walked in, not because you demanded respect, but because something about you disrupted the script. At first, they couldn't place it. They smiled, tried to pull you in, tested you, pushed your buttons. But when you didn't play the game, when you didn't shrink, when you didn't fall into the role they wanted, you became a threat they couldn't categorize. And that terrified them. You weren't sent to admire their illusion. You were sent to collapse it. They surrounded themselves with people who applauded their performance, people who were easy to fool, easy to mold. Then you showed up, grounded, aware, deeply aligned. You didn't need attention. You commanded awareness. Your silence wasn't absence. It was authority. Your boundaries weren't walls. They were declarations. They thought they could test your limits and still be adored. They thought they could play games and still be praised. But you gave them none of that. No validation, no reaction, no compromise. And that broke the fantasy. Let's answer what they're silently wrestling with now. Why can't I stop thinking about them? Because your presence didn't just visit, it revealed. You became the interruption they can't rewind, the shift they weren't prepared for. You didn't argue, you outgrew. You didn't fight for attention, you walked away from the noise. You didn't try to match their manipulation, you let your stillness become the reflection of their mess. You didn't need the spotlight, you were the shift in the atmosphere. You weren't interested in proving them wrong. You were focused on remaining right with yourself. That's what shook them. They thought you were temporary, a phase, a moment. Now they're realizing you were the moment everything changed. You were the chapter that turned their story into a mirror. You were the page where their narrative fell apart, not because you tried to break them, but because you refused to break yourself to fit their mold. You were never meant to be liked. You were meant to be felt. And now, long after you're gone, they're still feeling the effects. Because they didn't just lose a connection. They lost the only person who ever saw them and didn't flinch. You didn't leave with a bang. You left with a boundary. And that's why they're unraveling in the very silence they once mistook for weakness. You were the disruption, the shift, the mirror, the lesson. And now, no matter who they try to replace you with, the echo of your presence will follow. Because you didn't just walk in, you woke them up. And sleep won't come easy after that. So now you see, chosen one, you didn't just handle them, you shifted something they never recovered from. You weren't a phase, you were the awakening, and no matter how they try to rewrite the story, you were the plot twist they never saw coming. Let that remind you of your power, your presence, and your purpose. If this message resonated, drop 777 in the comments to claim your growth. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to be reminded of what they carry. Thank you for being part of this mission. Your energy is not just rare, it's revolutionary.